November 1942. North Africa burned like a furnace turned skyward. The sun didn't rise here, it descended, crushing the desert beneath it, bleaching the world into bone and heat. The wind dragged dust across the dunes like sandpaper over steel. Convoys crawled through it, miles of jeeps and trucks rattling under the weight of fuel, drums, rations, ammunition, the arteries of an army stretching thin. Every vehicle carried its own heartbeat, a pulse of pistons and valves barely holding against the heat. Every man knew the same truth. If the engine died, so did they. Private Gordon Hawks hunched behind the wheel of his Willys Jeep, squinting through goggles filmed with grit. His gloves were slick with sweat, his throat a furnace. The Jeep jolted hard as it hit another rut, nearly throwing the radio operator from the back. "Watch it," the man barked, clutching his pack. Hawks didn't answer. He was listening to the sound under his boots, that thin, uneasy rattle that had become the anthem of every ride. It was the sound of engines starving, metal crying for breath. Then it happened. The cough, the stutter, the death rattle. The Jeep lurched once, twice, and went still. The convoy kept rolling for a few yards before the next truck behind them stalled, then another. Within minutes, the desert went quiet except for the hiss of cooling metal. Steam poured from hoods like ghosts rising from the sand. Hawks slammed his fist against the wheel. Not again. They'd already lost 5 vehicles this week, and none to enemy fire. Hawks jumped out, boots sinking into the powdery sand, and yanked open the hood. The heat hit him like a wall, a scalding breath that smelled of iron and failure. Inside, the oil was black and thick, bubbling around the edges like tar in a frying pan. The engine hadn't been shot, it had suffocated. "She's cooked," Hawks muttered. The sergeant climbed down from the lead truck, wiping grit from his face. "Write it up. Command says it's driver error." Hawks let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? Then I guess the desert's full of bad drivers." By mid-afternoon, the horizon had begun to shimmer, the air bending light until even mountains looked like mirages. The men sat in silence, rationing the last of their water, waiting for the recovery team that wouldn't come until nightfall if it came at all. One of them pulled a tin of tobacco from his pocket, lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The smoke barely rose before the wind stole it. "You ever think about home?" he asked. Hawks nodded, eyes on the dead machine. "Every time one of these things dies, I think about the tractors back on my dad's farm. They never gave up like this. You knew when they were tired, you could feel it. This one just quit." Up in the sky, a P-40 fighter droned overhead, dragging its shadow across the sand. The convoy watched it pass, all of them silently praying the pilot had better luck with his engine. The war, they realized, wasn't only fought with guns. It was fought with machines. And the machines were losing. Across the theater, the same story repeated. Trucks in Libya, freezing overnight after oil congealed into jelly. Tanks in Algeria seizing mid-assault when lubrication failed. Airfields grounded because engines wouldn't start before dawn. The Standard Army-issued motor oil, designed in peacetime laboratories back in Pennsylvania, had never met a desert before. In the heat, it thinned until it evaporated. In the cold, it thickened until it strangled the pistons. What worked in theory failed in battle, and the battlefield didn't forgive failure. By the end of 1942, the U.S. Army had deployed over 2 million vehicles worldwide, from the sands of Tunisia to the jungles of Burma, the snow of Alaska, the mud of Italy. Each engine depended on the same chemical promise: that oil would protect steel. That promise was breaking. Reports flooded the War Department. Engines not surviving more than 100 hours in field conditions, oil degradation suspected. But bureaucracy moved slower than war. Commanders wrote back that field operators were careless, that procedures weren't followed, that machines were fine if men weren't fools. They wrote this from offices cooled by electric fans, far from the desert's rage. Out here, in the furnace of North Africa, men were learning that the smallest failure in logistics could be as deadly as an ambush. When a truck died, the convoy stalled. When the convoy stalled, supply lines collapsed. A stuck engine could mean a platoon went hungry, a squad went unarmed, or an entire outpost went without water. Sometimes, it meant the wounded bled out waiting for an ambulance that never arrived. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sand in long black shadows, Hawks climbed onto the hood and looked out across the dead convoy metal carcasses half buried in dust. The silence was unbearable. A radio crackled faintly from one of the trucks, static mixed with a distant voice. Supply command. This is Convoy Delta engines down. Repeat, engines down. The voice faded, swallowed by the hiss of the desert wind. Hawks pulled a rag from his pocket, wiped the grease from his fingers. The rag came away dark and sticky. He stared at it for a long moment, then spoke without looking up. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "how many of us die because some guy in an office signed the wrong form?" The sergeant beside him didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, the temperature dropped fast, from 110 degrees to 40 inches an hour. The desert had no mercy, only extremes. The men huddled beneath the canvas tarps, eating cold rations, their breath turning to fog. Somewhere out in the dark, jackals howled. The engines cooled into silence. Hawks couldn't sleep. Every creak of metal felt like a groan, like the dying breath of something that had once carried them forward. He found himself whispering to the jeep as if to a wounded friend. "You did good," he said quietly. "You tried." At dawn, the sand had crusted over with frost. Hawks poured a thin trickle of gasoline into the oil tank, trying to loosen the sludge. The starter groaned once, twice, then refused. He kicked the tire. "Damn thing's got a shorter lifespan than my rifle." The others laughed, dry, humorless laughs that died quickly in the cold air. They all knew it wasn't funny. It was a kind of confession, the laughter of men too tired to be angry. When the rescue trucks finally arrived, most of the engines were beyond repair. They stripped what parts they could, loaded the survivors, and left the rest behind, black shapes against white sand, small tombstones of metal. Hawks turned once before leaving, looking back at the row of dead machines. It felt wrong to abandon them. In war, even steel deserved a burial. The convoy crawled back toward base. Dust trailed behind them like smoke from a funeral march. Hawks kept his eyes forward, hands gripping the wheel of the borrowed jeep. But his mind wandered to the reports, the failures, the endless repetition of the same mistake. Someone, somewhere, had to see it. Someone had to notice. Far away, across an ocean and a continent, in a maintenance depot in Montgomery, Alabama, a man was noticing. His name was Samuel Rivers. He was not a soldier, not a general, not a man of war. He was a mechanic drafted into the Army's Ordnance Corps, a quiet man who believed machines told the truth better than people did. While the War Department blamed the drivers, Rivers was reading the same reports Hawks cursed about, and he saw what everyone else ignored. The engines weren't failing because of men, they were failing because of oil. But Hawks didn't know that yet. All he knew was that the war felt heavier than it should, as if every mile was fought not against an enemy army but against the machines that refused to go any farther. He thought about that all the way back to camp, the irony that the world's most powerful military was losing not to Germany or Japan, but to chemistry. When the convoy reached the motor pool, mechanics swarmed over the dead jeeps like doctors over patients who'd already stopped breathing. One wiped his hands on his overalls and shook his head. "Same thing," he said. "Oil's cooked. Again." Hawks watched them drain the black sludge into a pan. It oozed slowly, thick as blood. The mechanic sighed. "They keep sending the same batch from Washington, says it meets spec." Hawks spat into the dirt. Spec doesn't drive through hell. Later, as the men unloaded what cargo they'd managed to save, Hawks looked at the line of replacement barrels waiting near the depot. Each one was stamped with the same mark, U.S. Army. Approved lubricant, 1,942. He couldn't help thinking it looked less like a label and more like a death sentence. Night fell over the base. The desert turned silver under the moon. Somewhere, a generator coughed to life. Hawks lay on his cot, listening to the sound, waiting for it to cease. It didn't. Not yet. The hum filled the darkness like a heartbeat. For now, it meant survival. War, he thought, was supposed to be about bullets and bravery. Nobody had warned him it would be about oil. Nobody had said a machine could die before a man did and take him with it. He rolled onto his back, eyes tracing the canvas above him. The engine sounds outside faded one by one until there was only the wind, whispering through the camp like a rumor. Far across the ocean, in that Alabama workshop, Samuel Rivers leaned over a desk littered with oil samples and field reports, running his fingers through the numbers. He could already see the pattern Hawks had lived through: the engines, the heat, the deaths. He didn't know the young driver's name, but before the war was done, his work would save him. In the desert, Hawks closed his eyes to the hum of sleeping machines. In Alabama, Rivers opened his eyes to the hum of an idea. Neither man knew it yet, but the war of oil had just begun. Montgomery, Alabama. Winter, 1942.
Chiến tranh
Far
vẫn
from
là
the
một trái
desert,
tim đập.
the air was damp with rain and oil. The ordnance depot stretched for miles, rows of hangars, testing sheds, and rail lines carrying the bones of war, engines, shells, gears, and steel. Inside Building 12B, the air smelled of gasoline and bureaucracy. A clock ticked above the drafting tables, counting seconds that could cost men their lives. Samuel Rivers sat in the corner, sleeves rolled up, a mechanic's body trapped in a soldier's uniform. His hands were built for fixing things, not saluting them. On his desk lay a stack of reports smuggled from field units, grease-stained, wrinkled, written by men who didn't have time to write. Each one told the same story: engines seizing, convoys stranded, drivers blamed. He read them like eulogies. Engine failed under load, oil blackened, viscosity lost. 2 trucks abandoned under fire. Maintenance insufficient, operator error. Operator error. The phrase had become a verdict, a ritual excuse stamped over every mechanical corpse from Tunisia to Sicily. But Rivers knew what operator error smelled like, and it didn't smell like burned oil. He stood, crossed the room to a map pinned to the wall. Red lines traced American supply routes from Norfolk to Oran, across the Atlantic, and into the furnace of Africa. He followed them with a grease-blackened finger. Every inch of red meant a convoy at risk. Every mark meant another chance for oil to fail. The depot behind him buzzed, typewriters clacking, wrenches clanging, orders shouted across echoing steel halls. The war machine in motion. But Rivers heard something else in the noise. The hum of complacency. It was steady, bureaucratic, fatal. "Rivers," his supervisor barked, "you're supposed to be on inspection detail." "I am," Rivers replied without looking up. "Just not the kind that fits on a checklist." The supervisor frowned. "You're not here to think, you're here to follow specs." "Specs written in an office 3 states from a battlefield," Rivers muttered. That night, long after the rest of the depot shut down, Rivers stayed. The rain hammered the tin roof in steady rhythm. He sat beneath the flicker of a single bulb, surrounded by open barrels of Army-issued motor oil. The label read, "Standard Lubricant, Type G12, approved by Quartermaster Corps." He dipped his finger in. The oil ran thin, too thin. When he rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, it evaporated almost instantly, leaving a faint, burnt scent. He poured it into a small engine rig and let it run. Within minutes, the smell of smoke filled the shed. He turned off the machine. "This stuff dies before the engine does," he whispered. He set up another test, this time mixing in a trace of synthetic polymer he'd salvaged from an aviation experiment. The blend was denser, grippier. He poured it into the test rig, restarted the engine, and waited. The hum stayed steady. The smoke never came. He watched the temperature gauge climb, 180, 190, 220, and still the machine ran smooth. Something inside him clicked, the same sound that had guided his hands since boyhood when he fixed broken radios and tractors on his father's farm. Machines didn't lie. Only people did. He wrote his findings down: every temperature, every change in viscosity, every drop of fuel consumed. Then he stapled it to one of the field reports and walked straight into his commanding officer's office. "Colonel Darnell, sir, we have a problem with the oil specs." Darnell didn't look up from his paperwork. "We've got a problem with everything, Rivers. That's what war is. This one's different. Engines are dying faster than they should. It's not the men, it's what we're feeding the machines." Darnell finally looked at him. "You accusing Washington of killing engines now?" "I'm saying the oil's breaking down under combat conditions. I've got proof. We need to test a new blend." "We don't change formulas in wartime," Darnell snapped. "You know how long it takes for approval? 6 months of lab work, field clearance, procurement. 6 months of engines failing, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You're out of line, Sergeant." Rivers met his stare. "Maybe, but so is the data."
Outside, thunder rolled. The war was half a world away, but it felt close, closer than ever. Rivers knew that somewhere across the Atlantic, men were dying not from bullets but from decisions made here, in rooms like this, under lights like these. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the image of a convoy stranded under a burning sun, soldiers waiting beside dead engines, the sound of silence replacing the hum of motion. The next morning, he wrote another report. Short, clear, unflinching. Recommendation: immediate review of lubricant composition for desert operations. Current formula demonstrates instability at high thermal stress. Synthetic alternative shows 80% improvement in endurance testing. He sent it up the chain. The response came back 2 weeks later. Proposal acknowledged. Under review. Nothing more. No signature. No date. Rivers folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his notebook. Then he did what every honest man eventually does in a dishonest system. He stopped asking for permission. That winter, he began mixing his formula in secret. At night, when the depot quieted and the guards made their rounds, he worked alone under the low hum of a single bulb. He siphoned leftover additives from aircraft labs, ester compounds meant for high-altitude engines. He scrounged stabilizers from tank recoil systems, viscosity modifiers from research waste. He worked with the precision of a surgeon, the patience of a priest. Each batch he refined by trial and error. Too thick, and the engines seized. Too thin, and it vanished in heat. By February 1943, he had something new, an oil that clung to metal even under blistering heat, that refused to boil, that kept machines alive longer than rules allowed. He filled 4 small drums and stashed them behind the maintenance hangar, painting over the labels with the words, "Hydraulic testing, restricted." It wasn't defiance for glory, it was defiance for survival. One rainy morning, Rivers stepped outside the hangar and looked toward the rail yard. A line of freight cars was being loaded with supplies bound for Norfolk, another anonymous shipment destined for the front. He watched the soldiers hauling crates of ammunition, fuel, rations. Every item had a form, a label, an approval. He tightened his jaw. His oil had none of those things, but it had something better, truth tested in fire. He rolled the barrels onto the loading platform himself, their metal scraping against the concrete. A guard glanced at him. "Testing shipment," Rivers said quickly. "Paperwork?" "On file," he lied. The barrels disappeared into the train's belly, swallowed by steel. Rivers stood there as the locomotive roared to life, its whistle cutting through the rain. The train began to move slowly, steadily dragging behind it the hope of men he would never meet. When the cars vanished into the fog, Rivers walked back into the empty hangar, hands trembling. He sat down, pulled open his notebook, and wrote a single line. "If this works, someone out there will live. If it doesn't, no one will ever know I tried." He closed the book, exhaled, and listened to the rain hammering on the roof. Far across the ocean, the desert still burned. Engines still died. But somewhere, a convoy would soon receive a shipment of oil thicker, stronger, more stubborn than the war itself. And when those engines roared back to life under the African sun, Samuel Rivers would still be here, nameless, uncredited, breaking the rules so others could keep moving. The man who asked dangerous questions had just broken the most dangerous one of all. He had stopped asking. Spring, 1943, Montgomery, Alabama. The rain had ended before sunrise, leaving a dull mist that hung over the depot like breath after confession. Samuel Rivers rolled 4 barrels across the slick concrete, their metal rims screeching against the floor. They were heavy, filled with the kind of silence that changes wars. The paint on their sides was dark, the stencils simple. Hydraulic testing, restricted, nothing else. No signatures, no serials, no one to blame. He worked alone, boots sliding through puddles of oil and rainwater. Every clang echoed across the empty yard. The freight train waited at the far end of the line, coughing steam into the grey air, ready to swallow whatever the army fed it. Ammunition, rations, fuel, lies. This time, it would carry something different, a secret no one asked for and no one could stop. A guard by the platform looked up. "Paperwork," he said. Rivers didn't flinch. "Filed last night. Engineering clearance." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Load 'em up." The barrels vanished into the belly of the train, disappearing behind rows of crates stamped with U.S. Army supply. The coupling lock snapped, the whistle screamed, and just like that, his 6 months of defiance were gone, heading east toward Norfolk, then farther across the Atlantic, into a war that didn't know his name. He stood still as the train pulled away, the vibration running through his boots, the rhythm of steel and certainty. He whispered, "Go," and turned back to the hangar, already erasing himself from the record. 3 weeks later, the barrels arrived in Tunisia. The desert was a graveyard of engines, machines baked under 120-degree heat until they seized and died, their oil burnt to tar. Private Gordon Hawks had seen it too many times, jeeps collapsing mid-convoy, trucks stalling in the middle of nowhere, while bullets hissed overhead. He'd stopped counting the number of times they'd been stranded. That morning, the sun rose white and merciless. The air shimmered. Hawks wiped sweat from his brow, tasting dust on his tongue. In the distance, 2 mechanics unloaded new oil drums from a supply truck. The barrels looked odd, darker than regulation issue, with hand-painted stencils that didn't match any quartermaster code. "What's that?" Hawks asked. The corporal grunted. "New stuff. Came in last night. No label, but restricted. Logistics says it's part of a test batch." Hawks frowned. "Tested by who?" "Don't know, don't care. If it keeps us moving, I'll bless it myself." When they pried the lid open, a different kind of scent rose from the barrel, sharp, clean, almost sweet. The oil inside was thick, amber-colored, glowing faintly under the sunlight. Hawks dipped a finger in, rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. It clung to his skin like honey. "Feels heavier," he said. "Good," the mechanic replied. "Maybe it'll last longer than 5 miles." By dawn, every jeep in the convoy had been filled. The engines started smooth. The hum was different, lower, steadier, confident. The convoy rolled out, wheels dragging dust through the dunes. Hawks tightened his grip on the wheel, waiting for the first cough, the familiar death rattle of metal choking under the desert. But the sound never came. 20 miles, 40, 60. The heat rose, the sand thickened, and still the jeeps kept running. No smoke, no engine stalls. The temperature gauge barely moved. When they reached the ridge overlooking Kasserine Pass, the desert below shimmered like molten glass. The air was a furnace, but the engines didn't care. For the first time in months, Hawks wasn't fighting the machine. He was part of it, a rhythm of motion, of survival. By the time the convoy reached the supply post, the men were stunned into silence. Every vehicle had made it. Not one had broken down. Hawks climbed out of his jeep and stared at the engine, its metal still breathing steady in the heat. He whispered, "You held on, didn't you?" That night, the men laughed around tin cups and cigarettes. Someone called it a miracle. Someone else called it dumb luck. Hawks didn't call it anything. He just wrote 3 words in his notebook. New oil works. In Alabama, Rivers worked under a different kind of heat. He'd gone back to his routine inspections, repair logs, bureaucratic monotony. No one mentioned the missing barrels. No one seemed to notice the quiet theft that had slipped across the ocean, until a folded telegram landed on his desk. Unit 42 delivered full cargo under extreme heat, 0 mechanical loss. Lubricant performance noted. Recommend expansion of testing. He read it twice. Then again. The room around him blurred. The sound of typewriters faded into a hum. He closed his eyes and saw it a convoy of men he'd never meet, driving through hell without stopping. Machines alive where they should have died. He felt something shift in his chest. Relief, vindication, fear. He folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his notebook. The war was still killing men, but it wasn't killing their engines, not anymore. He kept working, quietly, secretly. Another batch of oil, another round of midnight experiments. He adjusted the formula again, a fraction thicker, a shade darker. The next shipment went out under a new tag, Type R. No explanation, no approval. By late spring, word spread. The dark barrels began showing up across North Africa, in depots, in repair yards, in airfields. Mechanics didn't ask where they came from. They didn't have to. The oil spoke for itself. Engines stopped failing. Jeeps ran longer. Tanks rolled faster. Convoy losses dropped by half. The official reports didn't credit the oil. They credited improved field discipline. But the men knew better. A corporal in Sicily wrote in his maintenance log, "No breakdowns this week. Oil thicker than normal. Smells different. Feels like hope." Back in Tunisia, Hawks had started calling it the good stuff. The jeep that had once been his curse was now his lifeline. He'd driven it across 200 miles of sand, through sniper fire and storms, and it hadn't coughed once. He didn't know it yet, but the oil inside that engine had been mixed by a man standing alone in a rain-soaked depot 5,000 miles away, a man who'd broken the rules to keep him alive. The success couldn't stay hidden. In June 1943, quartermaster officers in Washington began to notice irregular supply manifests, unregistered barrels, missing serial numbers, oil shipments with no requisition forms. A telegram reached Alabama. Clarify origin of non-standard lubrication materials received in theater. Immediate review requested. Colonel Darnell called Rivers into his office. The blinds were drawn. The colonel's voice was low. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Rivers said nothing. Darnell slid the telegram across the desk. "You understand this is serious. Unauthorized modification of supply materials, falsified manifests, shipment of untested compounds, you could face court-martial." Rivers opened his notebook and turned to a page marked in red pencil. "These are the reports from Tunisia. 162 vehicles, 0 failures. You want to charge me with that too?" Darnell studied him for a long moment. "You know what this means?" "It means it works," Rivers said. The colonel sighed, leaned back. "You're lucky the war needs more miracles than martyrs." He folded the telegram and tore it in half. "Get back to work. Officially, this conversation never happened." In the desert, the war rolled on. By July, Rivers' oil now whispered through channels as Type R was everywhere. From Sicily to Burma, from the jungles to the dunes, engines ran longer, cleaner, steadier. Mechanics etched small letters on their toolboxes. R equals reliable. Hawks noticed it too. His unit had crossed 3 battle zones without losing a single truck. The desert still burned, the sky still screamed, but the machines lived. And that meant the men did too. One evening, while refueling near Gafsa, Hawks stood beside his jeep and looked at the barrel of dark oil resting beside it. He ran his hand over the paint, tracing the faint letters through the dust. "Whoever made you," he murmured, "you saved us." In Alabama, Rivers stood alone in the depot's quiet. The inspectors would be coming soon. He could feel it in the air, the way a man feels thunder before it breaks. But for now, the night was still. He looked out toward the rail yard, where another train waited in the fog. He'd filled more barrels that afternoon, another shipment marked restricted. Somewhere, they would find their way to men like Hawks. Somewhere, the engines would keep running. He picked up his notebook, ran a thumb across the first telegram, the one that had changed everything. Then he smiled, not out of pride, but out of purpose. The war was still far from over. But at least the machines were no longer dying before the men did. And in a world drowning in rules, that was enough. The war was no longer measured by miles or medals. It was measured in movement engines that lived, machines that refused to die, supply lines that didn't stall. Somewhere between the deserts of Tunisia and the damp fields of Sicily, a whisper began to travel through the ranks. It wasn't about generals or victories. It was about oil, thicker, darker, different. Soldiers called it the good stuff. Mechanics called it Type R. No one knew where it came from. No one cared. In war, salvation never needed a signature. But salvation made people nervous. By July, the Quartermaster General's office in Washington had started connecting dots. Failure rates were dropping. Maintenance logs were cleaner, yet procurement records didn't match. Someone, somewhere, was changing the rules of war without permission. A message arrived at Montgomery Depot, addressed to Ordnance Command, ATN, Samuel Rivers. Clarify origin of non-standard lubrication materials received in North African and Sicilian theaters. Immediate inquiry required. Rivers read it without blinking. Then he folded it neatly and slipped it into his leather notebook, the same book that held every report, every test, every quiet victory. He could feel the walls closing in, not with noise, but with silence, the bureaucratic kind that waited, patient and cold. He went back to work. Engines on the test bench, barrels stacked in the corner, the scent of steel and defiance in the air. He wasn't a hero, he was a mechanic, but in 1943, that was enough to start a war of his own. 2 weeks later, 2 inspectors from the quartermaster's office arrived at Montgomery. Their uniforms were clean, their eyes sharp, their clipboards already half-filled. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like rules wearing boots. They asked questions that didn't sound like questions. Where did these barrels originate? What does Type R stand for? Who authorized non-standard blending? Rivers gave the same answer every time. Performance test. Desert adaptation trials. They wrote it down. Who approved the test? He paused. The results did. That line hung in the air, heavy as the smell of oil. The inspectors exchanged a glance. They didn't argue, men like them never did. They just wrote faster. When they left the office that night, Rivers watched their car disappear into the rain. He didn't know whether they believed him. He only knew that the next train carrying his oil would still leave on schedule. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Type R was rewriting the front lines. August 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. More than 3,000 landing craft, 150,000 men, and 14,000 vehicles hit the beaches under fire. The terrain was brutal, steep hills, mud roads, heat that melted paint. Engines should have died within hours. They didn't. In field report after field report, the same words appeared. No failures, pressure stable, vehicles operational. The new oil had become invisible infrastructure, the uncredited miracle. A sergeant from the 91st Armored wrote in his notebook, "We don't know what's in these barrels, but it's saving more lives than prayer." Private Gordon Hawks knew it firsthand. His jeep had been through North Africa, now Sicily, still running on that same strange blend. The paint was chipped, the tires worn thin, but the motor sounded as smooth as the day it was filled. During one mission outside Palermo, his convoy came under sniper fire. A truck ahead was hit, tires shredded, but Hawks gunned the jeep forward, hauling it with a tow cable up a hill of loose gravel. The strain was brutal, sand dragging, gears screaming, but the engine held. When they reached safety, his commanding officer clapped him on the shoulder. "Didn't think that old heap could climb." "She didn't think either," Hawks said. "She just ran." The jeep idled quietly beside him, oil glinting in the sunlight like blood that refused to dry. Back in Alabama, the inquiry was tightening its grip. Colonel James Darnell called Rivers into his office for a private meeting. The blinds were half-drawn, the air thick with cigarette smoke. On the desk lay a stack of papers, memos, telegrams, field reports. "You know why you're here," Darnell said. "Yes, sir. They're asking questions I can't answer." "I figured they would. You could lose your commission for this, Rivers. Court-martial, fraud, falsification of materials. Hell, they could hang you with paperwork alone." Rivers didn't move. "Then they'll have to find me under the hood." Darnell exhaled, a long, tired sound. "You broke every regulation we have," Rivers nodded. "And kept every engine alive." Silence filled the room. The colonel looked down at the latest report, one from Sicily. Convoy losses reduced to 0. Lubricant type R. He tapped the page with his finger. "If I bury this, I'm complicit." "If you don't," Rivers said, "men D." The colonel stared at him for a long time, then folded the report and placed it in his drawer. "Get back to work, Sergeant. Officially, you were never here." By the fall of 1943, Type R had spread beyond control. What began as 4 barrels in a freight car was now fueling half the Allied advance across Europe. The oil wasn't listed in any catalogue, but it appeared on every requisition form anyway, copied by clerks who didn't understand it but trusted the results. Mechanics wrote R on engines in chalk, a quiet mark of survival. Pilots mentioned it in passing during maintenance briefings. Convoy commanders sent letters to logistics praising improved lubricant performance, but nobody said why. Nobody mentioned rivers. He didn't mind. In war, truth moved slower than oil. December 1943. Montgomery Depot was quieter now. Most of the heavy equipment had been transferred north for European campaigns. The nights were longer, the rain colder. Rivers worked alone, refining his formula by lamplight. Each new batch was steadier, cleaner. He tested it on generators, field rigs, anything that had moving parts. The results were flawless. He wrote it all down: temperatures, burn rates, viscosity retention, filling the final pages of his notebook. The last entry read, "We fixed what the system ignored. That's all that matters." He didn't see himself as a revolutionary, just a man who refused to watch the world stall. Across the Atlantic, the war was changing shape. The Allies were preparing something enormous, an invasion larger than anything the world had ever seen. D-Day was coming, though no one said the name yet. Rivers didn't know it, but his oil was already there, buried inside shipments, marked essential frontline priority. Colonel Darnell had quietly arranged it. A dozen units in England had been supplied with Type R, unacknowledged but indispensable. In February 1944, a final cable arrived at Montgomery. Request additional shipment of lubricant, Type R urgent, field necessity verified. No signature, just coordinates. Rivers read it once, then began filling new barrels. He knew this would be his last batch before the storm. He painted over the labels himself, hands steady despite the cold. The same words as before: hydraulic testing, restricted. The same lie that had kept the truth alive. When the train left the yard that night, he stood under the rain and watched it fade into darkness. Steam swallowed the light, rails glistening like veins in the earth. He whispered, "Go finish what we started." Months later, on a beach in Normandy, engines roared to life under enemy fire. Tanks clawed through mud that could have drowned them. Trucks rolled off landing craft onto sand, slick with salt and blood. The standard oils froze. The cheap ones thickened. But the machines marked with Type R kept moving, dragging the invasion forward, fed by the stubborn will of one mechanic, half a world away. No medals, no citations, just the sound of engines that refused to stop. And somewhere, in a small workshop in Alabama, Samuel Rivers closed his notebook for the last time. The quiet war was over. The next one, the one history would forget to mention, was just beginning. Spring 1945. The war was breathing its last, slow, ragged, mechanical. Europe was rubble and fog. The engines that had dragged men through hell were still running, coughing smoke across bridges made of ash. From the Ardennes to the Alps, convoys kept moving, fed not by glory or orders, but by momentum, by oil that refused to burn away. They called it the Alabama blend now, though no one knew what that meant. It had no patent, no file number, no official record. Yet it lived everywhere, in the crankcases of Shermans grinding through Belgium, in the engines of ambulances ferrying the wounded from broken cities, in the veins of victory itself. By March, the Allied front was moving faster than logistics could record. Mobility miracle, newspapers called it. Tanks rolling longer than design limits, jeeps running through snow and mud without freezing. The data came in clean and impossible. Engine failures down 43% across European theaters. Fuel efficiency up 12%. Convoy delays reduced by half. Behind every number was a heartbeat, and behind that heartbeat, one man who had already disappeared. In Montgomery, Alabama, the depot yard was quiet again. The war's noise had moved overseas, leaving behind the ghosts of engines long dismantled. Samuel Rivers stood alone in his workshop, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, staring at the empty space where the barrels used to stand. He'd sent his last shipment months ago, the one that reached Normandy. After that, the orders stopped coming, the questions stopped too. The war had bigger headlines now: liberation, surrender, peace, peace. The words sounded strange in the room that had known only work and secrecy. Rivers sat down at his bench. The leather notebook lay open pages smudged with oil and graphite, filled with numbers, sketches, and one truth written 100 different ways. Machines live when we care enough to fix what others ignore. He turned to the last entry. It was dated June 1944, written the day Darnell approved the unspoken continuation of Type R. We built something that works because it had to. That's all the history that matters. He closed the book and exhaled. The war had ended. But history, like oil, had a way of clinging. Across the ocean, soldiers were still driving through the ruins of a dying empire. Private Gordon Hawks, now a staff sergeant, sat inside his same jeep, scarred, patched, painted over a dozen times, but still alive. The hood bore the faint ghost of the old stencil, U.S. Army, 42nd Division. He was somewhere outside Frankfurt when he realized the engine had been running without failure for nearly 2 years. He thought about the desert, the heat, the first time the oil didn't fail. Somewhere, someone had made that happen. He reached into the glove box and pulled out his battered notebook, the one he'd started in Tunisia. Between yellowed pages and sand grit, he reread the first line. "Engines didn't quit today." He smiled. It seemed small then. It wasn't. That afternoon, as tanks rolled through German villages and civilians watched from broken windows, Hawks drove on. The world was shifting beneath his tires, but the sound of the engine stayed steady, the hum of persistence, the rhythm of survival. He would go home eventually, back to Kansas, back to the farm. He'd tell stories about smoke and dust and comrades, but he would never mention the oil, because to him it wasn't a story. It was something sacred, too quiet, too real to explain. When Germany surrendered in May, Montgomery celebrated like the rest of America. Flags, confetti, brass bands. Rivers didn't go downtown. He stayed at the depot, watching the sky turn from gray to gold. Colonel Darnell found him there, still working. "War's over, Sam," he said. "Machines still need fixing," Rivers replied. The colonel smiled faintly. "There's talk of post-war contracts, synthetic lubricants. Civilians will want the same stuff we've been using. Maybe they'll give you credit this time." Rivers shook his head. "They won't, and they shouldn't. The war gave us everything we needed to learn. Let the next man make it better." He wiped his hands on a rag, leaving dark streaks across the fabric. "Besides," he added, "I didn't do it for credit. I did it so the engines stopped dying before the men did." Darnell nodded slowly. He'd known men who chased medals and men who chased meaning. Rivers was the second kind, the rarer kind. The months after the war blurred together. The army absorbed his formula quietly into its new technical manuals. No signature, no name, just a footnote. Synthetic additives recommended for thermal stability under combat conditions. By 1947, oil companies were producing civilian versions. Ads boasted field-tested performance, proven under extreme conditions, inspired by military innovation. None mentioned the man who had risked his career to make it happen. Rivers didn't mind. He'd left the depot, opened a small auto shop off Highway 31. Locals brought in their trucks and tractors, engines coated in dust, tired from life rather than war. He fixed them the same way he'd fixed everything else, with patience, precision, and quiet defiance. Sometimes, when the radio played news from Europe, reconstruction, treaties, parades, he'd look up from his work and think of the men who never made it back. The ones who'd died because their machines hadn't held, the ones who'd lived because they had. In Washington, a report crossed a desk in 1948. It was a post-war analysis of Allied logistics. The last paragraph read, "Advances in synthetic lubrication during field operations contributed to a 40% reduction in mechanical loss across all theaters from 1,943-45. Source material unverified. Individual credit unspecified." The report was filed, stamped confidential, and buried. But the number 40% would echo through engineering circles for decades. And in Alabama, a man with grease-stained hands would never know how far his shadow reached. By the time the 1,000 950 seconds came, the world had shifted again. The Cold War, jet engines, highways, the era of speed. Rivers' quiet rebellion had become the foundation for everything that moved fast and far. Synthetic oil, mass production, reliability, all the miracles born from a mechanic's midnight experiment. One day, a young engineer visited his garage. "You're Samuel Rivers, right? The ordnance guy? My professor mentioned your work, said it changed the game." Rivers laughed softly. "I didn't change the game. I just kept it running." He handed the kid a wrench and nodded toward an old truck on the lift. "Engines don't care about fame, son. They care about friction." The boy smiled, not understanding yet. He would someday. Years later, when Rivers died quietly in his sleep, the local paper wrote 5 lines. "Samuel T. Rivers, 58, retired mechanic and veteran, died at home. Survived by his wife and daughter. Known for his meticulous craftsmanship and service during World War II. There was no mention of oil, no mention of history, but in the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, in a binder labeled Field Performance 1943-45, there was a note scrawled in pencil beside a test entry. "Type R, recommend continued use." No signature, just the letter R. History remembers victory in noise, guns, speeches, flags. It rarely remembers the silence that made those victories possible, the hum of engines that didn't stall, the whisper of oil holding the line, the steady rhythm of men like Rivers who chose to act instead of wait. In the end, that was his true legacy. Motion itself. Every revolution of a piston, every hum of an engine in the decades to come, from tractors to tanks, from highways to skies, carried a trace of his defiance. A single decision, made in a rain-soaked depot in 1943, had kept the world moving forward. And though no one would write his name in the books, every machine that refused to stop was writing it anyway, one turn at a time. Because in the quiet war, heroes don't need to be remembered. They just need to keep things running.